Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. It's your boy Xile once again discussing the Iran war for hopefully the last time, but at this rate probably not. Um this whole Iran situation has dominated headlines for the past couple weeks, but I wanted to actually break it down for you. We'll break down the peace deal, we'll look at what's happening, what's real, what's not real, and where we're headed in the future. This is the fourth part in a four-part series. If you haven't watched the previous videos, don't worry about it. But if you are curious, for example, why this war started, or some of the military strikes and actions that took place earlier in the war, go back and watch those first three videos. I will not be discussing any of that in this video because we need to push ahead. Alright, so what exactly will we be talking about today? Well, first, we're going to outline the Memorandum of Understanding, aka the MOU. We'll talk about what it does, what it doesn't do, and we will compare it to the JCPOA, aka the Obama nuclear deal. We'll talk about how this deal represents basically a conditional surrender on behalf of the Americans. We'll talk about how the flow of oil, or lack thereof, is going to impact the global economy in the very near future. And we'll talk about why exactly the oil hasn't been flowing, namely Israel. We'll talk about how the issue of Israel has caused a certain splintering within domestic American politics, which was the most surprising and interesting part of all of this, in my opinion. We'll talk about the peace talks that took place in Switzerland last weekend. And finally, I will end the video by discussing where we're going into the future. As usual, I will try and make some predictions. And as usual, they are not pretty. Alright, let's look at this Memorandum of Understanding now. So, first of all, the most important clause, and the one that, allegedly anyway, started this whole conflict, is the deal that Iran reaffirms that it shall never procure or develop nuclear weapons. Now, what exactly that means? Does that mean, inspectors are going to be allowed into the country? Does that mean Iran will have to allow U.S. Inspectors into the country? Nobody knows. That part of the deal has not been negotiated yet. That's what this whole 60-day period is for, is to negotiate specifically the nuclear material, nuclear weapons side of it all. Of course, this is almost identical to the language that appeared in the JCPOA. It also calls for an immediate end to all military operations on all fronts, including Lebanon. It says specifically Lebanon like 4 times. The Iranians are very insistent that the ongoing Israeli invasion of Lebanon is part of this deal. The problem is Israel disagrees. Israel did not sign this deal. In fact, the entire negotiating process of this deal was kept secret from them because the Americans knew that if Israel caught wind of it, and caught wind of the fact that it requires them to withdraw from Lebanon, they would do everything in their power to stand against it. It also calls for a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz with no tolls for 60 days. A couple things about this. First of all, strait's already closed. Okay. Second of all, the whole no tolls thing only applies for 60 days. After those 60 days are up, Iran is already in the process of negotiating some sort of fee, some sort of payment system with Oman, so that any vessel that wants to pass through the Strait of Hormuz now needs to pay Iran. I would not be surprised if in the future, going forward, that is the truth of the matter. The U.S. will lift their naval blockade. That has already happened, although we still have some carrier strike groups hanging out in the ocean, but they are no longer blocking traffic. The U.S. will give Iran $300 billion for reconstruction. Okay, this is the important one. All the rest of this stuff is basically to be expected from any sort of peace deal between the two countries. But this $300 billion did not need to happen. I mentioned in my last video that the reason the U.S. didn't want to initially pay any sort of war reparations is that the payment of war reparations is tantamount to surrender. It is saying, I lost the war, I will give you some money because I lost the war. Okay? No, nobody who wins a war pays war reparations. All right, that has literally never happened. So, and Trump can spin this however he wants. He can say, oh, they're using the money to buy soybeans and wheat from American farmers, or, 2/3 of the money will come from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. It doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, we are giving them money. Trump has been claiming that this is not us giving money directly to Iran. This is some sort of investment pool, and that's kind of true. The problem is nobody actually wants to invest in Iran, right? The last time this happened, the last time when the JCPOA was signed, a bunch of European countries actually did invest billions of dollars into Iran. The problem was, as soon as Trump ripped up the agreement and all the sanctions kicked back into place, Iran essentially seized all those assets, seized all that money, and the European companies lost, billions upon billions of dollars. Nobody wants a repeat of that incident. So these reports that I'm seeing that, like, Japan and South Korea have already agreed to invest $100 billion or whatever into Iran, it's probably bullshit. Nobody would be willing to front the risk necessary to actually invest money into Iran, especially considering the fact that their economy is pretty devastated right now. Their infrastructure is pretty devastated. There's no guarantee that they would ever get a return on that investment. But because, according to this deal, we need to give them $300 billion in one way or another, I have a feeling a lot of that money, if this deal is followed through with, will just come straight from the American taxpayers. Specifically, $300 billion is the low number. It is possible, though not likely, that number will be even higher. All the Memorandum of Understanding says is that it should be at least $300 billion. And by the way, Qatar has already started paying Iran. I think they're up to $10 billion right now. So certain amounts of funds are already being transferred. The final point is that the U.S. will commit to ending all types of sanctions against Iran. This includes sanctions proposed by the UN. So it will actually take a vote of the UN Security Council to actually lift all these sanctions on Iran. But that was one of the only things that was successfully negotiated in Switzerland, was a mechanism for the United States to slowly begin lifting all of the sanctions on Iran. Those include diplomatic sanctions, they include economic sanctions. All forms of sanctions need to be lifted by the end of this 60-day negotiation period. Now, obviously, this is much, much, much worse than the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, right? The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, all we paid Iran was like a couple $2 billion in assets that we had frozen, so that was their own money that we just gave back to them. And Iran allowed inspectors into their country, and we gave them some limited sanctions relief. All without losing a single American life, all without the Strait of Hormuz being closed, all without the death and destruction that we've witnessed over the past couple of months. So this deal that Trump has made is way worse than that, and basically invalidates the whole reason for us even starting this war, and him ripping up the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018. It's also worth noting that before the first American bomb even fell, the Iranians, and this is according to multiple intelligence agencies, by the way, the Iranians were willing to negotiate, and they were actually willing to place harsher restrictions on their enrichment and their stockpiles than were present under the JCPOA. But instead, we bombed them because Israel told us to, basically. I should also note one final point. All Iranian frozen assets, both inside the U.S. and outside of the U.S., should be unfrozen as part of this deal, and that has already started to happen, and that money is already starting to trickle back into Iran. All right. So when I call this the most humiliating defeat in American history, I am not exaggerating. You can say, Vietnam was our most humiliating defeat, but the thing is, we didn't pay the Viet Cong billions of dollars to get out of Vietnam. We just left. Same thing in Iraq, right? We didn't pay the new Iraqi we gave the Iraqi government billions of dollars to try and prop them up, but we didn't do it in the sense that we were paying them to leave us alone, right? Same thing in Afghanistan. We didn't pay the Taliban billions of dollars in order to make peace. We just pulled all our troops out and left. This is the first time through the force of an actual treaty that we are acknowledging that we lost a war since, I don't know, the War of 1812, maybe, kind of. Yeah, basically this is unprecedented in American history. Um, it's also super ironic that this treaty was signed during the G7 summit while Trump was at the Palace of Versailles, and that is the picture that is pictured over here on the left. This is ironic because this is the exact same place Germany signed their documents of surrender immediately after the First World War. I have a feeling all of the other world leaders, such as Macron, pictured here, knew about the irony of this, knew what this sort of symbolically represented, but of course Trump didn't because he's an idiot who's never read a book in his life and knows nothing about history. It's also pretty funny watching some of the comments that Trump made at this summit, where he basically said that the U.S. would no longer go as hard as they have been on Iran's missile program, that essentially he said that Iran has the right to defend itself. I believe the exact quote is, "If everyone else have these missiles, is it really fair for us to say, no, Iran, you can't have them?" As I mentioned earlier, Iran is in the process of applying a toll in order for ships to navigate through the Strait of Hormuz. This is more significant than most people realize, okay? Ever since the end of the Second World War, the United States has facilitated the explosion of global trade. And we've done this through our overwhelming naval presence. This is a cornerstone of the American empire, of the American century. The freedom of navigation for all naval vessels is so essential, is an essential pillar to the modern world, to the modern economy. Okay, it is completely integral to the way that the world works these days. But Iran is essentially doing away with that. They're saying, no, we're not going to have freedom of navigation. We're not going to have free movements of cargo, of energy. Now you got to pay us if you want to use our waterways. And this could set a dangerous precedent going forward. For example, Malaysia could do this with the Strait of Malacca. Or, I don't know, Chile could do this with Drake's Passage or something like that, right? It doesn't, or here's a good example. Spain could do it with the Straits of Gibraltar. That's a pretty good example. This, more than anything else, more than the war operations, more than the fact that we are breaking with Israel, is the clearest sign that the American empire is in decline, that this operation has failed, because it expressly goes against the geopolitical interests that we have held for the past, 80 years. And all of this has come without any real peace. That's the worst part of all this, is that we're giving them all this money, we're giving them all these concessions, we're not even touching the nuclear question until later down the line. We're kicking that can down the road, and yet real peace hasn't been achieved. The strait is still closed, as I'll talk about later in the video. Renewed bombing has already been undertaken by the Americans. It's entirely possible that in the very near future, none of this even mattered in the first place because the deal would just be ripped up because both sides are just continuously violating it. Let's take a closer look at the oil situation. First of all, Trump gave this very revealing comment last week at the G7 summit.
Now, if I did the opposite, if I went out and continued to bomb them for another 4, just bomb the hell out of them, I'd get bad press on that. No, there's nothing I can do. But what this does is it allows the ships to go. If we keep bombing, those ships won't be going. And you're talking about $500, $600, $700 million a day. It's a lot of money. A lot of money. That's why the world is okay. It's liquid. It's fine. Also, we run out of reserves in about 4 weeks. There are reserves all over the world, and we would really run out. And there'll be a time when you wouldn't be able to get it. And you want to see Bedlam?
Now, the reason he's saying that is because somebody told him that. And if somebody told him that, it's probably true. Another thing that I don't see many people consider is our strategic reserve stockpiles, okay? So over here is the graph of the total strategic reserve in America, and as you can see, once this war started, it started to decline precipitously. So we went from about 415,000 barrels to just under 330,000 barrels, okay? Now that is only an increase of, that is only a decrease of about 25%, which on paper doesn't seem that bad. Here's the problem, though. A lot of the oil that is actually in all of these massive storage tanks is literally just sludge, right? None of these tanks are ever fully emptied, okay? Fully emptying any of these tanks is very bad. That is never done. So what happens is, over the years and over the decades that all this oil is sitting in these tanks, the heavier stuff, the stuff that you can't refine into fuel, gradually starts to kind of sift to the bottom. That's like the asphalt, the stuff they make asphalt out of. And it turns into this kind of goopy sludge. And that oil is completely unusable. So even though it's counted in the strategic oil reserve, all of that sludge that's completely useless for fuel is kind of inflating the numbers, kind of pushing them up. The other thing is, we're about to hit what's called the operational minimum. So what that means is, even though there is oil in a storage tank somewhere, that oil cannot get where it needs to go in order to assure the continued smooth functioning of the economy. Okay, so we're about to see a bunch of small, tiny, localized oil shortages here in the next couple of weeks. And even though there is oil that could have been refined into fuel, that could make up that shortfall, it's simply at the wrong place and the wrong time, and we don't have the infrastructure to pipe it to where it needs to go. There's actually no oil pipeline that crosses the country, okay? The West Coast is completely isolated from the oil fields of, for example, the Permian Basin, all right? Let's break it down by another metric, by the number of barrels of oil that should have been crossing the strait. So before this whole war, there were about 13 million barrels of oil that crossed the Strait of Hormuz every day, okay? If you do the math, by the way, and you calculate for the number of days that the strait has been closed, which at this point is over 110, that comes out to over 1 billion barrels of lost oil. Now, since the MOU has been in effect, Iran has actually been able to export about 1.5 million barrels of oil from the strait every day. And there's also been a couple 100,000 of barrels that are making it out from ships that are turning off their transponders and kind of sneaking through. Although I have a feeling, given the most recent attacks, that might stop. So because the U.S. lifted their naval blockade, Iran is actually able to sell their oil once again, mostly again to China. Real quick, speaking of China, it's worth noting that they have actually not touched their oil reserve at all. They have the largest strategic oil reserve in the entire world, and they haven't drained it a single drop. This is because they are preparing for the future, just in case the Strait of Hormuz actually does remain closed. Xi Jinping likes to think in, terms of decades instead of 4-year cycles like American politicians typically do. So that he's willing to play the long game and wait it out and ensure that he and his country have enough oil in case this crisis continues. There's also been about 1.5 million barrels that are not counted because of something called demand destruction. And demand destruction essentially means as the price of oil gets higher, the demand for it decreases, and people just buy less oil, basically. Now, if you do the math, 1.5 plus 1.5 is only 3 million barrels, which is not bigger than 13 million. So, while the combination of ships sneaking through the strait and demand destruction is pushing doomsday back, a couple weeks at least, at the end of the day, it is not going to save us. We are still dangerously close to running out of oil. What exactly will this look like? So let's say the Strait of Hormuz opened tomorrow. The first thing you got to realize is that there are dozens of ships in the Strait of Hormuz right now that are completely full of oil, but they just can't make it through to the markets that, desire their oil. So if the Strait of Hormuz would open tomorrow, those ships would go to the refineries, that oil would be refined into fuel, and that fuel would then have to be transported to markets wherever. And that whole process takes about 2 months. So from the day the Strait of Hormuz opens, fast forward 2 months, that's when you can expect prices for gasoline to start going down. Beyond that, the infrastructure that has been taken offline, that has been shut down manually, because they have nowhere to store all the oil that are coming out of these oil fields, right? Because none of it's being exported. That will take about 6 months to a year to come back online. The infrastructure that's been destroyed, Cog Island, certain Kuwaiti and Saudi oil fields, and that giant liquid natural gas facility in Qatar, that's minimum 5 years away from being fixed. So that gives you a kind of timeline, right? So if the Strait of Hormuz opens, boom, 2 months from now, there's a sharp drop, but then prices will take over, or at least 5 years to actually stabilize, for us to actually get to the level that we were at before this war even started. Again, the strait is still closed. The Iranians have launched drone strikes against multiple ships, and a oil tanker registered in Singapore was actually hit. All of that happened, I think, 2 days ago. The most recent breaking news that happened was that America has actually retaliated. So in response to these vessels being targeted, America has actually bombed a couple of drone and missile bases along the Iranian coast. What exactly that means going forward, does that cause a further tit-for-tat escalation, or is that the end of it? You in the future will have the benefit of knowing. I, however, in the present, on this the day, Saturday, June 27th, don't know. Future Xile here. Iran has retaliated. They have struck targets, American forces in both Bahrain and Kuwait. We'll see if this leads to further escalation. The peace deal is basically on life support at this point. So, why hasn't the strait been open? Why are we still on the brink of total global financial crisis? Well, the main reason is because Israel is refusing to pull out of Lebanon. Now, I know some of you are skeptical with how, shall we say, fervent the Israeli desire to continue war is. Some of you may have this idea that, Israel ultimately desires peace, and the only reason they're still in Lebanon and in Gaza is to eliminate terrorists, or whatever sob story you've been fed by CNN and the New York Times or whatever. Here's the reality, though. This tweet I'm about to read is the Israeli defense minister. Okay, he is like Pete Hegseth, basically. Okay, Pete Hegseth combined with the Secretary of Homeland Security. Okay. Let me read this for you word for word. For every tear of an Israeli mother, 1,000 Lebanese mother must weep. All of Lebanon must burn. With all due respect to the Americans, Israel must make it clear to the entire world that the blood of our sons and the security of our citizens are not forfeit. All of Lebanon must burn. Our supreme duty is to protect the citizens of Israel and the soldiers of the IDF, and this commitment takes precedence over every other consideration. I told the Prime Minister, even in our private meetings, for every tear of an Israeli mother, 1,000 Lebanese mothers must weep. Enough with the ping pong. In the Middle East, you don't win with measured responses and restraint. You need to go berserk, to obliterate, to crush the terror. Now, to translate that for you, what this guy, Ben-Gvir, again, this is not some random guy. This is not even some low-ranking government official. This guy is probably the third or fourth most powerful person in the entire Israeli government. He is saying, no, I don't care if the entire global economy collapses. I don't care if nobody can afford food or gasoline. We need to keep bombing Lebanon for allegedly protection, but really, reading that tweet made it sound like revenge or, I don't know, general bloodthirstiness. And to hell with America trying to impose the steel upon us. Immediately after the MOU was signed, Israel bombed the absolute shit out of Lebanon. They went on one of their biggest bombing campaigns, but 2 days later, they actually stopped. Okay? Now, at the time of this recording, fighting has picked up again. Israel has started bombing again. In fact, they've actually advanced beyond the Litani River, which was the line they said that they would stop at. They've actually advanced beyond that. Although I will say the tempo of fighting has slowed. There aren't nearly as many raids or as bombs falling on Lebanon as there were before the MOU was signed. Of course, as soon as they stopped bombing Lebanon, they started bombing various positions in Gaza because, at this point, why the hell not? It is also concerning that the rhetoric from the Israeli government over and over and over again is that they do not make a distinction between Hezbollah and Lebanon. They essentially, just like in Gaza, they view every citizen of Gaza as a Hamas terrorist. So too in Lebanon, do they view every Lebanese person as a Hezbollah agent, essentially. One of the biggest, and this sounds crazy. When I first heard this, I thought this was the craziest thing I'd ever heard. I thought there was no way this is true, but alas, we live in crazy times. One of the chief political groups inside of Israel that is pushing for this endless series of wars, that is pushing for all this territorial expansion, is what's called the Third Temple Movement. Now, if you know anything about the history of Israel, a long, long time ago, there was this thing called the First Temple, and then the Babylonians came and destroyed it, and then they rebuilt the temple when Cyrus the Great allowed the Jews to return to Israel, and then the Seleucid Empire, then the Roman Empire destroyed it again. And ever since then, the Temple Mount, where Al-Aqsa Mosque stands today, has not had a Jewish temple on it. But in order to fulfill the biblical prophecy of the apocalypse, a third temple must be rebuilt, and a red heifer must be sacrificed there. There is a concerted effort in Israel to make this happen, and they are aligned with the crazy American evangelical conservatives in the U.S. Okay, they are working in tandem in order to cause this biblical apocalypse, and you can just go read the Bible for the details on that. I'm not going to repeat all of them here. And recently, some actual action was taken in this direction. Israel has stripped the sovereignty rights of the territory that the Al-Aqsa Mosque sits on from Jordan, and are now going to administer it directly by the Israeli government, by the Israeli security forces. Okay, so that is a major escalation. If a third temple, is attempted to be constructed, I would not be surprised if every single neighboring country immediately declares war on Israel in order to try and prevent such a thing from occurring. Okay, it would be a massive middle finger to the entire Muslim world. Southern Lebanon is currently occupied, and Netanyahu and multiple Israeli officials have all said multiple times that they are not leaving. They have already begun demolishing homes. The plan is basically to turn this into another Golan Heights situation, where they move in Israeli citizens, even if the war were to wind down, and essentially annex all of southern Lebanon. Of course, now they're going beyond the Litani River, beyond where they said they would stop, so we'll have to see what happens on that front. Also today, a deal was signed between Israel and Lebanon to put a halt to the fighting. However, this deal actually doesn't mean anything, because the deal is between Israel and the Lebanese government, not between Israel and Hezbollah. That is a very important distinction that a lot of people miss. The Lebanese government is basically useless. Okay, they don't even effectively control their entire territory. They only really hold power in the capital of Beirut. Outside of the capital, Hezbollah holds most of the sway. So really, the Lebanese government has absolutely no authority to tell Hezbollah to do anything. And Hezbollah has already said that their deal with Lebanon means nothing, and that they will keep fighting. All right, so now let's talk about the valiant effort that J.D. Vance made to kind of drive a wedge between America and Israel. And I mean valiant effort sincerely for once. I'm not being sarcastic at all. Let's see some of the things he said immediately after the MOU was introduced.
What I will say, and this does bother me, is that you have seen people within Bibi's cabinet who have come out and attacked the deal, and in some ways very personally attacked the President of the United States. And I guess my message to them would be twofold. Number one, Donald J. Trump is the only head of state in the entire world who is sympathetic to the nation of Israel at this moment in time. And he happens to be the head of state of the world's superpower. If I was in the cabinet of the Israeli government, I might not be attacking the only powerful ally that I have anywhere left in the entire world. And the second message I would give to some of those cabinet members, Bibi, to his credit, has not gone down this path, but to some of these cabinet members in Israel who are attacking the President of the United States, the other thing that I would say is that over the last 3 months, two 2/3 of the defensive weapons that have protected your homeland have been built by American hands and paid for by American tax dollars. The problem for Israel is not Donald J. Trump. And anybody in Israel who thinks their biggest problem is the President of the United States needs to wake up and smell the reality of the situation that country is in. Thank you all.
It's worth noting there that the whole 2/3 of your weapons are manufactured in the United States. You know, that could be interpreted as a threat, like, hey, if you don't back off, all those weapons that you're using to wage war are gonna get cut off. Pretty interesting. Let's continue.
Say that Israel and the United States are fundamentally always aligned. It's just not true. We're different countries. We have different needs. We have different geographies.
Do you trust them?
You know, I don't trust anybody.
Now, any intellectually honest person would immediately be able to tell you that yes, everything he said there was true. Obviously, the interests of Israel and the interests of the United States are not identical, right? The interests of any two countries are not identical, okay? To suggest otherwise is completely ridiculous. But of course, pretty much everybody got mad at him for doing this, okay? Still, the fact that he did this in the first place, the fact that he even made the attempt to try and justify America splitting from Israel, tells me that there is now a chance that there is real political force, real political weight behind being anti-Zionist. And that has never happened before in American politics, at least for as long as I've been alive. Every single party, every single media institution has towed the Zionist line completely and utterly. Okay, so this is a big deal because this represents the first real break that I have ever seen. My theory is that J.D. Vance is going to try and use this as the 2028 wedge issue, okay? Obviously, he's the vice president. He wants to be president, or really Peter Thiel and all of his handlers want him to be president, and he's just happy to go along for the ride. Let's break this down, how exactly this would work. So, the thing is, right, a lot of Republicans are very, very pro-Israel, especially the evangelical ones, because they've been essentially propagandized to for decades upon decades upon decades about how, you know, Israel is the Holy Land and we need to support them, etc., etc. But the thing is, Republicans are cattle, right? They're basically dumb animals. They will believe and say and do whatever their leaders tell them to. So even though all of these church-going, you know, true-blooded red Americans have been fed nothing but pro-Israel propaganda for the past 40 years, it wouldn't surprise me if J.D. Vance got serious and actually did try and make a run for the president, that the, you know, mainstream press, or at least the mainstream right-wing press, aka Fox News or whatever, would fall in line behind that and support him in that endeavor. And he would be able to essentially not lose that much of the Republican base of support. However, that is not the same thing on the Democrat base of support. The issue of Israel is very clear. All the polling is very clear. Democrats, and by Democrats I mean the Democratic voters, do not side with Israel. The split is about 80-20. 80 against Israel, 20 pro-Israel. So if he can court enough of those anti-Israel voters, you know, call them single-issue voters, call them whatever you want, into his sort of neo-MAGA whatever coalition, he can make it all the way to the White House in 2028. That's the idea, anyway. That's the game plan. That's the 4D chess, whatever. Is it going to work? Well, it really depends on how well he's able to consolidate the anti-Israel messaging into mainstream Republican discourse. And to be honest, so far it hasn't worked very well, because only about 3 days after J.D. Vance tried this, we'll call it the anti-Zionist gambit, he was basically shot down, right? All of the mainstream organizations that were sort of considering it quickly flipped their talking points to, you know, calling what he said anti-Semitic. You know what they do. It's also curious that, you know, despite the fact that all of our woes, all of the economic turmoil is directly the fault of Israel at this point, because the U.S. has said it wants peace, Iran has said it wants peace, Israel is the only country that doesn't want peace. Despite this, Democrats have said nothing on the matter. The most you'll get out of Democrats on this issue is them doing what I did earlier in the video and pointing and laughing at Trump for negotiating a much worse deal than Obama did back during his presidency. That's the most you'll get. None of them are willing to criticize Israel. None of them are willing to say, Netanyahu, tear down this wall, get the hell out of Lebanon, etc. So that makes me think that really no matter what happens, unless there is such an overwhelming primary opposition movement within the Democrat Party where we get just a slew of anti-Israel politicians aggressively running against their establishment pro-Israel counterparts, the Democrats are basically unmovable on this issue. The mainstream Democrat politicians are unmovable on this issue. A piece of bipartisan legislation that actually recently passed was the War Powers Resolution. A couple days ago, Congress actually passed a War Powers Resolution that means that Trump is not allowed to take military action against Iran anymore. Of course, he basically ignored this and bombed them anyway. It's like that whole saying, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it really make a sound? If the president violates the law and no one's there to enforce it, did he really violate the law? Well, we're seeing a test of that in real time. All right, so last weekend, the first meeting between representatives from Iran and representatives from the United States met in Switzerland. And oh my God, it was a shit show. So, first of all, on the American side, who's going over there to Switzerland? Steve, Jared, and JD2. The Steve is Steve Witkoff. Steve Witkoff is one of Trump's buddies back from his real estate days, and he is one of the dumbest people working in Washington today. And in the Trump administration, that's really saying something. The only skill he even sort of understands is real estate deals in New York. He is woefully unprepared for anything else. I'm convinced he doesn't even know how to tie his shoes. He's basically just a complete moron. And the only reason he has the position he does is because he's friends with Trump. So he was the one that was put in charge of negotiating a peace deal with Russia over the Russia-Ukraine war. And he's so incompetent, he didn't even know what to do, so he just copied the peace deal Russia was proposing and then said, "Hey, Ukraine, sign this peace deal. It's great." And they said, "No, dude, you literally just stole the one from Russia. It doesn't benefit us in any way. Of course we're not going to sign it." And that's why there's no peace between Russia and Ukraine. Good job, Steve. Next up is Jared Kushner. Now, Jared Kushner is not a moron, unlike Steve, but he's not exactly a, genius either. Jared does not care about America. Jared doesn't even really care about Trump. The only thing Jared Kushner cares about is enriching himself. So the entire time he's been negotiating all these deals, and we've seen this time and time again when he negotiated the deals with the Middle East during Trump's first term, with Qatar, with Saudi Arabia, nothing that any of them said to him or proposed to him actually mattered. The only angle he viewed all of this from was, what's in it for me? How much money can I make out of it? And, well, that's why Saudi Arabia paid him $2 billion. So it goes without saying that he's has the same mindset going into these Iran talks. He doesn't give a shit about the nukes. He doesn't care about the Strait of Hormuz. The only thing he cares about is getting the most money and prestige out of this for himself as possible. Now, J.D. Vance was also in Switzerland, and again, I've said this in my last video too, J.D. Vance does want peace. J.D. Vance was authentically opposed to the war from the very beginning. J.D. Vance is not an idiot. He's not a moron. He's just a midwit, right? He's got, probably 105 IQ, not stupid, but not that smart either. But he is genuinely trying to get this peace deal through. Unfortunately, he is being hamstrung at every opportunity by the president himself. So the thing about Trump is, right, he'll just listen to and repeat the last person that talked to him, right? He's like a sieve, right? Everything just kind of flows in through one ear and out the other. Initially, J.D. Vance was the one that was able to successfully negotiate the MOU and pitch it to Trump as, yes, the Israelis will not be happy about this. It's time for us to break up with Israel anyway. And that was kind of his pitch, and that was the media strategy and the messaging that he went forward. And Trump he didn't exactly play along, but he didn't contradict that either, right? But the problem was with JD not by Trump's side anymore. All of the Zionists, like Lindsey Graham or Mary Madelson, came out of the woodwork and got to Trump and said, "Trump, you can't do this. We're betraying Israel. We're betraying our greatest ally. Something, something, Epstein files, maybe." And so Trump had this, all-time banger quote, supposedly in a phone call. He said, "Ahem. You close it and you won't have a country. You won't even make it back to your effing country. We may take over the strait if we have to. If they don't make a deal, we'll collect tolls." Completely psychotic, completely delusional. Basically, because Israel was refusing to pull out of Lebanon, Iran said they were closing the strait, and Trump got super mad about that and threw a little toddler tantrum, as he always does, and basically threatened to assassinate the entire Iranian negotiating team and blow them out of the sky and take over the strait and impose tolls himself, like that could ever happen logistically. And this caused every single Iranian diplomat to immediately stand up and leave the room, as they should have. Because what do you do when a toddler is throwing a tantrum? Do you give them candy? Do you pat them on the head? No, you just ignore them. You walk away. You let them cry it out, and then when they're calmed down, you come back, and then you can have a reasonable discussion. Trump has the temperament of a toddler. I'm glad the Iranians are treating him like a toddler. Like I said earlier, the only successful thing that came out of this whole Switzerland deal is now there's a mechanism for Iranian assets to be unfrozen and sanctions to be lifted. So what's going to happen now in the near future? Well, I think it's pretty obvious to anyone who's been paying attention that all right-wing movements, all far-right movements in all Western countries are essentially death cults, right? They really don't believe in anything. All they believe in is the glorious leader should be able to diddle as many kids as he wants and get as much money as he wants, and they'll all, march lockstep together towards oblivion. Think of that penguin video that the Department of Homeland Security posted a couple months back, and you'll get the idea. It's very obvious that the people who don't believe in climate change don't care about climate change, not only because the fossil fuel companies pay them to say stuff like that, but because they don't believe there will be a future. They are trying to cause the biblical apocalypse. They think that if Israel forms greater Israel and the third temple's built and the red heifer and all that jazz, they'll essentially be raptured to heaven, and they don't have to care about what happens here on Earth. That's why they don't care. That's why they don't care that the global economy is going to collapse. That's why they don't care that Americans are suffering. That's why they don't care about any of it, right? Is because they truly believe that, the world's ending anyway, and they might as well, write it out and have a grand old time, make a little money, do a little drugs, get down tonight. Piggybacking off of this, if Israel truly loses American support, which I think is pretty unlikely at this point, but if such a thing were to happen and militarily they started losing, they have this card up their sleeve they call the Samson option. Now, if you don't know the story of Samson, he was like a dude. He had super strength because of his hair or something. But at one point, there was like an enemy army or something attacking him, and he pulled down the pillars of a temple and had the temple collapse on top of him, killing everyone. So, what does this mean? It means if Israel is in danger of being defeated in a conventional military sense, they will deploy the nuclear option. Okay, this is official Israeli policy. I'm not making this up. Multiple Israeli prime ministers and Israeli government officials have confirmed that this is a real thing, and they would take this option if push came to shove. This should be terrifying for anybody who cares about, nuclear nonproliferation or, just the general health and safety of the world, because even a limited nuclear exchange would be bad news bears for pretty much everybody. And the difference between this and mutually assured destruction only happens when one country nukes another country. Israel is saying they will employ the nuclear option even if the nuclear option is not employed against them. That's the key here. So you want my opinion on this whole thing? We got about 60 days before industrial civilization starts coming apart at the seams. It's becoming increasingly clear that this 60-day peace window that we have right now is going to accomplish exactly nothing. Israel's unwilling to make peace, and at this point it looks like the United States is pretty much unwilling to make peace. Trump knows that the economy is about to completely fold. I mean, he won't ever admit it, but he knows, deep down he knows. And if that happens, then unless they really truly just straight up rig the midterms, it's basically guaranteed the Republicans will be completely humiliated all the way down the ballot. So he's scrambling, essentially, trying to get something through, trying to get the Strait of Hormuz open. I just don't see it happening. If you want to cut through all the bullshit, here's my advice. There's really only two things you need to pay attention to. Everything else, all the stuff that Trump's saying, all the stuff that the Iranians are saying, all the discussions about, bombings in Gaza or the Middle East or whatever, all of that is just a distraction. There's only two things you actually need to focus on. Number one, is the strait open? Yes or no? And don't trust the U.S. Don't trust the U.S. to say if the strait's open or not, because Trump has lied about this time and time and time again. He said the strait's open when it's not so many times. Listen to Iran. Is Iran saying the strait is open or closed? Because ultimately, at this day and age, they are the ones that control the strait, whether we like it or not. And the other thing is Israel still occupying southern Lebanon? Because theoretically, if Israel were to withdraw from southern Lebanon, then the strait would be open. Pay very close attention to any escalations coming out of Lebanon to determine what the future will look like. Okay, that was all wonderful, wasn't it? Yeah, I feel great right now. Y'all gotta take care of yourselves, all right? I'm seriously quite worried. Go out and buy like a month's supply of food. Go out and buy some water purification tablets. Go out and buy that thing that you can use to stop your bathtub and fill your bathtub with water, just in case. I'm not saying it's going to get that bad. It's very doubtful that you'll lose electricity or plumbing anytime soon. But hey, it never hurts to be prepared. That's all from me on this one. I'll catch y'all on the flip side.